From Iran to Russia, Afghanistan to Haiti, protests rage across the globe as the people demand change. What's driving unrest and how are governments reacting? We'll take you around the world for the latest. Now, on The Inside Story, the People's Protest.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Lee, VOA correspondent. It's been a tumultuous few weeks with protests in regions around the globe. In Iran, women are cutting their hair and removing their hijabs in protest of the death of a young woman in police custody, detained because her hijab did not cover all of her hair. Across Russia, there have been anti-war protests, attacks on military recruitment offices, and an exodus of military-aged men, all in response to President Vladimir Putin's September 21st announcement mobilizing 300,000 military reservists for Russia's war on Ukraine. We're going to start with the growing tension in Russia's reaction to Putin's decision to activate reservists, and criticism of the war are not limited to street protests. It is spilling into government-controlled media, calls for an end to the invasion of Ukraine, and the impeachment of Vladimir Putin resonates through the city of St. Petersburg. Here's Henry Ridgwell with a report from VOA's Moscow Bureau.
For several years, opposition members of St. Petersburg's city assembly have been meeting in this pizzeria because the authorities won't let them into parliament. In recent weeks, this small group of lawmakers has shaken Russian politics by presenting a formal petition for the impeachment of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We chose to use a new rhetoric. We are Liberal MPs, and up to now we were concerned more with social issues. In this petition for Putin's removal, we focus on the fact that he has caused fundamental damage to the Russian Federation, not to another state, but to the citizens of our country.
Their demand to remove Putin from power is based on their belief that the war in Ukraine, what Putin calls a special military operation, is a personal project of the Russian president.
I am convinced that if Vladimir Putin ceases to be president, this special operation in Ukraine will not continue.
These opposition lawmakers have already been fined, and they accept that they could face further criminal charges.
Many people are worried that something might happen to us, but someone has to do something.
The petition has also energized St. Petersburg's civil society into open defiance. In this small bar in St. Petersburg, young poets gather to read their poems critical of Putin's war in Ukraine. They believe the time has come to speak their minds.
The courage of the intellectuals who stand against the war gives people hope, gives people motivation and strength to continue fighting, since you discover that you are not alone.
Most people to this day remain silent. But perhaps that is changing because we see the news, but it will take time.
There is an ever-present fear that these actions, no matter how small, could lead to arrest.
Fear affects anyone. It's a normal reaction. Only idiots and Alexei Navalny are not afraid. I am not Navalny, and I am not an idiot. So yes, I am afraid.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine has not only upended global security, but has plunged Russia into political and social instability. The consequences are difficult to predict. Millions of young Russians, an entire generation, face a deeply uncertain future. For VOA's Moscow Bureau, Henry Ridgwell in London.
Hundreds of people have reportedly been detained as Russia cracks down on protests and dissent. I spoke to Rafael Sakov from VOA's Russian service to get a better perspective of the impact protests are having on Russian society and the pressure it puts on Putin and the Russian government.
Of course, it's quite difficult to compare the protests which have been since the first days of the full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine, since February 24, 2022, and the protests which just have been now during the last 2 weeks, beginning from September 21st, when Putin announced mobilization. These were two different groups of people protesting, taking to the streets. First, during the first wave of protests, if we can call them like this, it were mostly opposition activists, well known after Alexei Navalny protests, Russian opposition leader, who is now in prison, as we know, and of course, there were some ordinary people who were not opposition activists as well, going to the streets because they were just against this war in Ukraine. So they were just saying that we don't want this war in Ukraine to happen. And many people still were silenced because they were afraid of being detained or being just beaten, and they just stood at home. Some of them left the country immediately during the first weeks or months after the aggression, and including some opposition activists and some opposition leaders. Some of them, those people who stayed in Russia, went to the streets right now after mobilization because it added some new reasons. Like people were saying that they don't want to fight themselves with their own hands in Ukraine, or they don't want their fathers, brothers, husbands to be sent to Ukraine to fight. And that's why, by the way, there are many women now in the process, and as many experts and witnesses say that there are many women. And so you see, this is the second wave, and this second wave is also now leaving the country in huge margins.
Putin has a firm control of the Russian media, and a lot of these protesters have been arrested. So do observers think that these protests will impact the political environment in Russia?
What the observers say, it's only the atmosphere of fear which is spread now all over Russia. It's like atmosphere of fear. There are tortures. There are, people who face prison terms. We know that Alexei Navalny is in prison, as I already said. Also, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, Andrei Pivovarov. There are famous activist opposition leaders who are now in custody. So the Russian authorities, they did everything to silence the opposition movement, opposition leaders who could, unite people in Russia, who could, lead them to different protests in every Russian region. And for now, people don't have, a center which coordinates these protests or something. So people are just, if they feel themselves strong enough to go into the streets, they are going to the streets. People who don't feel strong, they just leave the country. So, of course, Putin, by his, decision to launch a full-scale aggression now against Ukraine and silencing all opposition, closing almost all independent media and just making all independent journalists leave the country as well, just made impossible for people in Russia to get real information. Even for us, for VOA, for example, we don't have reporters now on the ground in Russia. But it's really, really difficult, and we see that still some people in Russia try not only to go to the protests, but, for example, put on fire Russian enlistment offices, military enlistment offices. There were already 17 cases in the last 2 weeks since mobilization was announced. So it shows that, of course, people try to use different ways to show their protests, but how can it, make impact on Putin? Nobody knows. Probably it's impossible.
Protests calling for the resignation of Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry have become an almost daily event in the Caribbean nation. Since August 22nd, thousands of people have marched to voice their frustration over the government's inability to handle an acute fuel shortage, gang violence, and soaring inflation. VOA Creole Service Chief Sandra Lemaire takes us inside the situation.
Haitians continue to take to the streets on an almost daily basis nationwide to protest against an acute gas shortage, food insecurity, soaring inflation, and to demand Prime Minister Ariel Henry step down.
We, the people, do not recognize Ariel Henry. We didn't vote for him. Ariel Henry has no legitimacy.
Henry was named Prime Minister by slain Haitian President Jovenel Moïse shortly before his death in July of 2021. Under his governance, living conditions have worsened as rival gangs battle for control of more territory in and around the capital. Businesses and schools shuttered after protests turned violent and looting ensued. Henry condemned the violence and looting in a national address on September 18th.
The country has issues. We have to work together to resolve them. Violence has no part. Violence will not lead to anything. I am appealing for calm.
But Henry's pleas were met with anger and defiance. During a United Nations Security Council meeting to discuss the situation in Haiti on September 26th, China's ambassador, Geng Shuang, expressed concern and asked for a list of gangs, their leaders, and politicians who are responsible for stoking violence and protests. U.S. Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Brian Nichols, told VOA the Biden administration is ready to sanction the gangs.
We are very focused on strengthening the Haitian National Police, on providing humanitarian assistance, and especially going after those political figures who are funding the unrest in Haiti, whether they are in Haiti or they are somewhere abroad. We know who they are, and we're working through the Security Council to identify them and to impose sanctions.
There is bipartisan support for sanctions among members of Congress as well. But Haitians VOA spoke to during a protest on October 3rd said the solution for the country's problems should come from the people, not the international community, nor Haiti's politicians.
For this battle, the people must take charge of their own destiny. We don't support the Montana Accord, Penn Accord. We want the Street Accord. We need to take charge of our destiny.
In the meantime, living conditions continue to worsen as anger grows among the citizens.
We are out here in the streets until Ariel Henry resigns. We are not discussing gasoline with him. Our objective is, as long as Henry stays in power, we will not go home.
Sandra Lemaire for VOA News, Washington.
Women around the world have taken to social media, cutting their hair in solidarity with women in Iran who are protesting strict government requirements to wear the hijab and outraged about the death of one young woman in custody of the so-called hijab police. And 3 weeks after Mahsa Amini's death, street protests are still taking place in Iran and elsewhere. Let's begin with VOA senior diplomatic correspondent, Cindy Sain.
Protests have now been seen in cities and towns in nearly all of Iran's 31 provinces. In this cell phone video obtained by VOA Persian, Iranian police are seen shooting at defiant protesters late Wednesday in the northwestern town of Bukhan in West Azerbaijan province. The protests began on September 16th with the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who was held in captivity by Iran's morality police for improperly wearing her hijab or headscarf.
It's a very simple fact. Mahsa Amini should be alive today. The only reason she's not is because of the brutal repression that the so-called morality police exercised against her, and what we're seeing, the same type of repression and brutality that Iranian authorities are implementing or employing against their own citizens.
Iranian women have been sharing videos on social media of themselves cutting their hair in protest of Amini's death. like this one posted on Twitter by Faeze Afshan. Nasiba Shamsai, an Iranian women's rights activist, cut her hair in front of the Iranian consulate in Istanbul, chanting freedom. Tehran government rules make it mandatory for women to cover their hair in public. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi told the UN General Assembly on Wednesday he proudly defends the rights of his people. But Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Robert Menendez said Raisi must be living in an alternative universe.
You know, the death of this young 22-year-old woman by the morality police in Iran is an example that is not about human rights. It's not about human rights when Iranian women cannot fully enjoy their place in Iranian society. It's not about human rights when you use your money not to help feed the people, but to arm different groups who create acts of terrorism.
VOA asked Republican Senator Rob Portman about President Joe Biden's UNGA remarks, during which he said diplomacy is the best way to deal with Tehran.
To me, the key is getting the rest of the free world to join us. So not just our allies in the Middle East, many of whom are very worried about the direction of Iran and what Iran is doing, not just with regard to the nuclear weapons, but also with regard to their exportation of terrorism around the region. But everybody should stand up together.
For now, the world is focused on the ongoing protests sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, including this one in New York. Tehran says she died of a heart attack, but her family says that is not plausible. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
So what happened in the hours after Mahsa Amini died in police custody and before the world took notice? VOA's Arash Arbasadi takes us through the story of the woman who sparked a global movement.
It's been 3 weeks of sometimes violent street demonstrations in Iran. Dozens of protesters have died, some have killed security forces. This all started when 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, a college student with her eyes set on higher education, became the face of a global movement for human rights. Iran's morality police arrested Amini for what they described as immodest attire. 3 days later, in their custody, she was dead. The Islamic Republic released a video it says comes from a police station showing Amini falling to the ground. Officials say the fall triggered a fatal heart attack. Her family says Amini had no known history of heart troubles. That's when protests began, at first without the Islamic Republic crushing them as they have demonstrations in the past. But recently, Iran's violence on its people has returned as demonstrations turned bloody at the hands of security forces.
دختر جوانی درگذشت خب حادثه تلخی بود.
Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called Amini's death a sad incident and said he was heartbroken, but he quickly shifted blame of unrest on usual foils, the United States and Israel.
We're alarmed and appalled by reports.
The Biden administration says it's alarmed and appalled at what it sees as overreaction by violent security forces clashing with mostly unarmed protesters. Joining her family, Amini's supporters refute the cause of death, instead blaming Iran's morality police for going too far. And many Iranians say her death was the martyr spark that lit outraged cries for change. Amini's family, in the meantime, today has more questions than they do answers. Here's her father, Amjad Amini, in an interview with VOA Persian shortly after her death. He says, the authorities never told us the result of the autopsy. They wrote a report the way they wanted it to be. The authorities promised to do a full investigation, but I swear to God that I do not believe a single word they say. I do not trust them at all, and I am sure they are lying. Whatever they do or say won't bring back my girl to us. Some of the girls who were arrested alongside her told us that Mahsa received a blow to the head with a bat. It is a lie. I swear to God that she did not have any preconditions. Amjad Amini also said his only request is that his daughter's life not be forgotten. Arash Arbasadi, VOA News.
Siamak Deganpour has been covering Iran, the United States, and the intersection of the two countries for VOA and our Persian service for nearly 20 years. I asked him to dissect the protests we've been seeing and compare them to see the demonstrations we've seen in Iran previously.
You know that the cycles of protest are getting shorter every year in Iran. We had, after 2009, so-called Green Movement protests. We had many other nationwide protests in Iran. One was 2019, November 2019, and many others that were brutally cracked down by the security apparatus of the government. Hundreds of people got shot and killed. When we talk about coming from 2009 all the way to today, there are lots of events happen and things get uglier and uglier the way the government responded to people's demand for changes. What we are witnessing today is different in many aspects. One is that in Iran, we see now we are into 4th weeks of the protests. So 3 weeks have passed, and this has been going on constantly. Every day we have people from Kurdistan or from Balochistan or from every corner of Iran. Someday are students, university students. Now we see school students coming into the streets. So this is different in terms of the nature. It's different in terms of the unprecedented level of solidarity among Iranians. Outside of Iran, we saw 150 cities had protests across the world. And also it's different comparing to 2009, because 2009 we had Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi as leaders of those uprisings. What we're witnessing today has no specific leaders, and that's probably make it harder for the government to put an end to it, because they've been arresting everybody, but they don't know how to stop it. It's very interesting that when we look back at 1979 revolution, shortly after the revolution, we saw women coming to the street protesting the compulsory hijab. So the resentment and the dissatisfaction of the women in Iran about the restriction being put onto them, goes back to decades, so it's nothing new. Back then, people were protesting against the one faction of the government. The issue was who is going to run the government, but now everybody is rejecting the entirety of the system. So the demands have been radicalized because the government responded unwisely.
Are people more hopeful? Do they expect something to come out of this? Do these most current protests pose a real political threat to Iran's internal structure?
What I can say is that the government, you see the fear in the government's response to this current protests. The way, as I mentioned, hundreds, thousands of people have been arrested, tens of journalists, celebrities, athletes, artists. You can't believe the way they've been responding to anybody who is posting criticism on Instagram or anywhere. So this shows that the government doesn't know how to deal with this magnitude of dissatisfaction. But the other way of understanding how the government is reacting is just listen to what the Supreme Leader, after 2 weeks of silence, said. He blamed everybody but the government. He put the blame on the youth, on the athletes, on anybody, on elite, and obviously on the US and Israel. That's what they usually do. So this shows the government doesn't have any answer for their demand, and people are not going to go away by just putting hundreds of thousands of them into the jail, because as I mentioned, this has been going on generation after generation, and now we see granddaughters of those women who showed up on 79 after the revolution objecting compulsory hijab. Now they're coming back to take revenge of their grandmothers.
That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Stay up to date on all of today's stories at voanews.com. Follow VOA News on Instagram and Facebook, and follow me on Twitter at EliTV1. You can catch up on past episodes of The Inside Story and check out new mini docs on our free streaming service, VOA Plus. See you next week for The Inside Story.